Welcome to part 4, and just to pick things back up, we talked about the impasse where we're trying to reconstruct the original form of the Old Testament text. We have these three sort of competing witnesses, and how do you break that impasse? Well, one of the most exciting discoveries in the 20th century was the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And the Dead Sea Scrolls were found in the whole area around the Dead Sea, so the scholarly translations of these are called the Discoveries in the Judean Desert. And essentially, they've been associated with a group called the Essenes, and these are some archaeological remains from the home of the Essenes in the Judean wilderness. This is Qumran, Qumran. Here's an aerial view, so we're not talking about a massive place, but these persons had lots of different texts, and in the first century when the Romans were attacking and putting down the first Jewish revolt, the Essenes scattered their texts and hid them in different places for protection. Here's a site of their cistern, or perhaps a baptismal, or perhaps, who knows, maybe this was the original built-in swimming pool. Yeah, of course, just kidding, but this would have been something that would have held water. Here's a picture of, this is from the Isaiah scroll. This is one of the best preserved of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and you can see this is an entire page of texts. Most aren't like this. Most are very fragmentary, but this is the Isaiah scroll is an example of a complete copy that was found. And many of the texts were found in containers such as this. This is a fragment of a pesher. Not only were biblical manuscripts found, but also commentaries. The Essenes wrote commentaries. That's what pesher means. And here's an example of a commentary written on Hosea chapter 2, verses 8 to 14. And I also want to put this slide up because look at the bottom. You can see the way that the Dead Sea Scrolls are coded. If you look at the 4Q166 or 4QPHOSA, the 4 stands for cave, the Q stands for Qumran, and then you have two different kind of nomenclatures. The 166 is the document number, or in the case of the coding in parentheses, that's 4, K4, Qumran, Pesher, Hosea, A. So presumably there's a second Pesher that was found there that would be B, but you can see this was copied from the late 1st century. Okay, here's a cave. Here's an example of one of the caves in which some of the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, and they were found all over the region, but you can see this is a fairly isolated cave that would have been hard to get to. That's why one of the reasons they were preserved, and also the dry and arid environment out there. It's another shot of the aerial ruins. So let's talk about what are the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls are an eclectic mix of texts in the Judean desert. Again, associated with the Essenes. This was an apocalyptic group, separatist group that essentially pulled out of Jewish society, moved out into the Judean wilderness to wait for the Messiah to come. And again, they were centered around the site of Qumran. And there were 3 different kinds of texts that were found. There were sectarian texts that essentially talked about the Essene beliefs. Some of their documents, which you could read if you're interested in, would be the Treasure Scroll, Manual Discipline. They were ascetics. They were very strict. And then probably the best title, the Sons of Light and the Sons of Darkness. And I guess you can probably guess which of those 2 groups the Essenes believed that they were. I guess no one ever thinks that they're the Sons of Darkness, right? There's also Peshers. A series of commentaries were found on the biblical books. And then the biblical texts themselves. And essentially at Qumran, lots of biblical texts, often multiple copies and versions of biblical texts. And all of the Old Testament books that we have in our Old Testament were found except for the book of Esther. Now, perhaps it was there and it just hasn't been found, or maybe Esther wasn't accepted by the Essenes specifically because Esther had a couple issues. Number one, that she definitely accommodated herself to living in the Persian Empire, and that would have been a no-no for the Essenes. They withdrew. They were separatists. And also the kind of shaky moral values in Esther, when essentially she uses her own sexuality to try to save her people, and that would have been troubling to the very strict Essenes. So those are reasons why Esther would not possibly have been included in the canon that the Essenes used. Now, what do the Dead Sea Scrolls do for us? Well, if you remember our impasse, the Dead Sea Scrolls were important because they're really early texts. The Essenes were out in the wilderness from the 2nd century BC into the late 1st century. And so all the texts are at least from that period, and some of the texts that have been found are even earlier, and they're written in Hebrew. And so these are the earliest Hebrew manuscripts that we have as evidence and witness to the shape of the Hebrew Bible, so very significant. But the problem is they're fragmentary. I showed you that picture of the Isaiah scroll. That gives you a bad picture. Most of the texts from Qumran are literally just little pieces, not even as good as that Pesher fragment that I showed you. Sometimes we're just talking about a piece of a verse. So we have actual ancient Hebrew texts, but the problem again is that we don't have complete Hebrew text, so it's spotty. Again, here's a coding for 4Q Exodus A. This would have been Cave 4 Qumran, and this would have been a copy of Exodus. The most famous text that's been found was the Isaiah scroll. And what was amazing about it, and you've probably heard this, is that essentially, scholars thought, well, geez, here's a Hebrew version of Isaiah from the Dead Sea. It's at least 1,000 years earlier than our Masoretic text. Let's look and see how many errors there are. But what's amazingly, when the scroll is unrolled and transcribed, it's essentially 99 point plus the same. So our Masoretic text is a witness to an early version of the Hebrew text. So what's the contribution? Ultimately, the Dead Sea Scrolls show us that behind the Masoretic text, the Septuagint, and the Samaritan Pentateuch are original Hebrew manuscripts. So that's good and bad, right? I mean, so in other words, we said that the Septuagint had a shorter version of Jeremiah and a longer version of Samuel. Well, guess what? The Qumran community had both the Hebrew text behind the Masoretic text, which was a longer version of Jeremiah, shorter version of Samuel, and the Septuagint's shorter version of Jeremiah, longer version of Samuel. And also there's texts that show that the Samaritan Pentateuch, its variants were actually authentic. So what the Dead Sea Scrolls show is that all three of our previously available traditions are rooted in a Hebrew Vorlage. That means there's a foundation for them in an ancient Hebrew traditions. And so what this has led to is a theory of textual families. In other words, why are there three different types of traditions, essentially, that witness to the Hebrew Bible? It's because in the ancient world there were three different Jewish communities. There was the traditional Jewish community that lived in Palestine, and that text is ultimately witnessed to in the Samaritan Pentateuch. There was the Jewish community that lived in Alexandria, Egypt, and they produced the Septuagint, but underneath that would have been the original Hebrew text that the early Jewish exiles or persons fleeing persecution carried with them. And then the Masoretic text looks like it comes from a Babylonian provenance, where those who went into exile and lived in Babylon took the Hebrew Bible with them, and the Masoretic text is a witness to that version of it. Of course, all of those texts come back and get mixed in like for the Essenes, because that's the homeland, and so all the texts would have come back. But it looks like there were kind of three original textual families, and somewhere underneath those three is the original final form of the text that came off the author or the editor. So textual criticism is working to reconstruct that. So what are our implications? Well, the first thing you want to say is that the findings of textual criticism, they're not as refined as they are in the New Testament. When you take New Testament introduction, you'll see that really essential confidence that we know what the original Greek text was, except for maybe in just a couple of places. That's not quite true in the Old Testament. There's some questions where we're not sure about what words mean, exactly what the text would have looked like, but essentially, overall, the contribution of textual criticism is to give us confidence that when we're reading the Old Testament, scholars are highly confident that we've reconstructed essentially what the original text would have looked like, with the caveat that there are still some uncertainty in readings. Now, if you're interested in reading a little bit more, let me suggest a couple of resources. Kyle McCarter, KYLEMCCARTER, has a book on textual criticism, as does Emmanuel Tove, T-O-V. I'll add these in as another post to give you the bibliography on there, but those would be a couple of books that you could look at to learn a little bit more about textual criticism. Otherwise, let me know if you have any questions, and we'll talk about it online. Hope you all have a great rest of your week. Bye.